Um, yeah, so it's the finale of two 8-session series, and so I can't think of anybody better to join us and a more relevant topic than mobilizing the workforce, because this was born several months ago as a way of kind of working our way through the COVID crisis and the economic implication of it, and now it's looking to the future. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you today. Folks will be sending questions to Adam and Erica, and then at the end in the Q&A session, they'll pitch those to you. It makes it a little bit easier as more people log on and that sort of thing. So as a quick introduction, you've been doing quite a bit of work in research in and around human resources and organizational behavior for years. And recently we've got a chance to kind of collaborate on organizational agility, but more importantly, workforce transformation underpinning that. And I think that that's a great foundation and baseline for our conversation today. And I know you've got a couple slides that you've put together. Do you want me just to toss it to you and you can kind of share your deck and go through it and then we'll open it up to Q&A? Or do you want to, your preference?
Yeah, that'd be fine. Yep, I'm happy to manage it on this end, and then really want to provide folks with a chance to, to ask the questions that you're facing, especially about workforce-related issues. And yeah, and I was able to move my 1 o'clock a little bit back, so I've got more time. If our conversation goes past that, then certainly I'll be available and want to make myself flexible to answer those questions.
Great. Okay. Well, I think you've got the control and the ability to share.
Awesome sauce. All right. Cool. Let me get going here with this, and all right. So again, thank you so much, Mike, for the invitation to come, and thank you all for joining us. I know you're taking time out of busy schedules to be here. I'm Tim Munyon. I work in the Department of Management, of course, with graduate and executive education with Mike and others at UT. I also co-founded and now help manage a workforce consultancy, Red Castle, and our focus is really on using data, but we're passionate about people, and we want companies to wisely invest. And so today's topic is really germane to both of these different roles. And I'm very excited to be here with you all. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the foundations when we talk, what does it mean to mobilize the workforce? And what are some things that we should consider along the way? I realize that most of you are not human resource professionals. This is not what you do. And so some of these topics may be new to you. For others, it may be, old hat, but regardless, I want to get us first on kind of a common foundation, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and comments, just feedback, so we can work through some of these issues together. All right. So when we talk about what do we mean by mobilization, the idea is, is moving your workforce. And there are a lot of meanings behind this. Obviously performance toward greater performance is one of those, but we're also mobilizing our workforce to learn. We're also mobilizing our workforce to change and adapt to environmental stimuli. And we're also learning as an organization in response to what's happening around us and what are people, the knowledge they're giving us from customers. So mobilization is definitely this multifaceted concept, but let me work through some of the logistics of the process and things to consider when we talk about mobilization and agility. First, the idea of objectives. What is it that your workforce is responsible for in the value chain? How is it that they create value? Is it with the customer experience and customer service? Is it with innovation and technology, in engineering space? Is it with greater efficiencies on the operational side? Or is it, the relationships that are developed through sales and marketing? Whatever it is, like what is it that you're seeking to get out of your workforce? We've got to start there. And that's the first thing we want to look at in terms of mobilization, is saying, okay, where are we mobilizing? What are we mobilizing toward? In the same way, if you're taking a trip, the method, the destination will dictate the means of transportation. And we always want to start here. If you're traveling to the Middle East, it's going to require a boat or a plane. A car won't get you there. So start with your objectives. In the same way, we want to look at the plans that derive from these. Now that we have our destination in mind for our workforce, what are some of the mechanisms that can get us there? What are the roads that we can travel to go there? And roads often incur trade-offs. When you think about this, to use the metaphor of transportation, when you're traveling through plane, it's fast, but it can also be more expensive. When you're traveling through car, less expensive but slower. And in the same way, when you're mobilizing a workforce, and agility is one of those things that can be helpful to us, but at a cost, like we'll talk about a little later. So This is really the segment of, okay, how do we now that we've got some strategic objectives for our workforce, we understand how value is created. Let's actually break that down tactically and say, okay, what are the mechanisms we can use to get to these destinations? It may be the customer experience. How do we drive our customer experience through our workforce? Next is this idea of opportunity, where we're looking at this not as a dictate from above, but how can we frame these as opportunities to help people realize their goals as well? What we know from the social psychology research is that when people participate in goals, when they're a part of this process, they feel like they're so much more vested in success or failure. And so you want a workforce that's going to view these kind of changes, this mobilization, opportunistically, like, okay, what is in it for me, and how can I benefit and grow as an individual? The incorporation, participative decision making earlier in the process is one conduit to achieve that. In the same way, we've got to be looking at the ability profile of the workforce. I'd like to think that all of us have, incredibly talented employees, and we have the right managers and leaders in place, and we have the right financial resources, technological resources to support these folks. That's not always the case, and so you want to look at ability and capability, not only of your people but also the organization whenever you're considering a mobilization towards something broader, because this will ultimately dictate that this is kind of the lower end, the necessary but insufficient condition to getting people moving. In the same way, you could have a very capable workforce that's very adept, that's technologically resourced, well funded, but if they're not motivated and if they're not working together, it will run awry. And culture can be one of those big inhibitors in terms of demotivating employees, but so can unclear or ambiguous links between what I do and how I'm rewarded or recognized. A lack of justice, a lack of fairness in the workplace. We talk about these things as either motivators or demotivators for your workforce. And the idea finally is we also want people to pour themselves into the work itself. When we're mobilizing a workforce, one of these end states that we were looking for is engagement, and that's satisfaction, involvement, and enthusiasm. Only because that's going to sustain any mobilization effort. That's going to help keep and propel that workforce forward, and propel it forward across difficult obstacles, which you'll undoubtedly run into. Now, intertwining through all of this is this idea of alignment, and it's a simple idea, but the basic concept is, however your company differentiates itself from others, however your organization differentiates itself, however you do that, like your efforts, your objectives need to be well aligned. The resources that you spend need to be well aligned with what's happening strategically, and this kind of we can have good plans, and sometimes even successful organizations can literally perish from 1,000 great ideas. Why? Because they lose sight of the strategy, they lose sight of that vision, and these things are good, but they're not aligned with what the company is trying to achieve from a macro perspective. So this is a very basic model of mobilization, but it describes this process and kind of some of the key ingredients, and that's what we're looking for. When you're creating when you're seeking to mobilize your workforce and make your workforce agile, these are some of the things that you need to consider, or pieces of the pie, so to speak. So, and of course, agility is what? It's the ability to flex in any one or more of these constructs at a given time. And so, how agile you are in your workforce, well, it depends on the workforce itself, but also you can build this in. When we talk about agility, the ability to pivot or change, fundamentally what we're doing is we're building in some flexibility with the people that we have in place. Our flexibility in planning, our flexibility in who we hire and how, flexibility in how we incentivize our people to work. Let me give you an example. In the Second World War, the Germans had extraordinary early success in the conflict, and one of the reasons that they were so successful was because they gave their operational managers, not their strategic leaders, but their operational managers, these commanders, they gave them the ability to pivot based on what was happening in the environment in which they were in. So they had an objective and said, hey, this is the objective. However you see fit to realize this objective, go and get it done. And that latitude was something that the Allies did not have. And so as a result, early in the conflict, Allied military units, they didn't have this agility, the ability to flex in accordance to dynamic and uncertain environments. And as a result, they were not nearly as competitive in the early stages of the war as their German adversaries. That's something that they picked up later in the war, but it's a key lesson for us too. Agility enables your workforce, your people, to pivot and to change in response to competitive contingencies. It can be an advantage, and sometimes for some of us, especially in this COVID era, You recognize perhaps more than ever the importance of considering agility and how to build this core capability. So here's the trick. There's always a trick, right? When someone says this is always the right answer, you should always say, well, the right answer is always it depends. There is an innate trade-off between agility and efficiency. When we think about the agile workforce, they have to have slack. They have to have extra resources that enable them to change course. If you think about, hey, I've got this much fuel to get between destination A and B, if I add in another destination, now that requires extra fuel. And it's the same thing with your workforce. When you enable operational managers to deviate, when you enable your employees to deviate, to become agile, even in how you're learning, how you're growing, cross-training, these things all trade off against workforce efficiencies. So you just have to recognize that in any managerial practice, and agility is extraordinarily important, there's always a trade-off that results from that process as well. And in this instance, the key trade-off is efficiency in terms of operational efficiency. It is more costly to be agile. Now, does that help? Does that trade off with effectiveness? Yes, absolutely. So that's a big part of this process too. But I would be remiss if I gave you that idea. In terms of selling agility without recognizing some of the constraints that result from it as well. So moving smartly ahead, when we think about the digital era, digitization is really just the application of digital technologies in an attempt to streamline what we're doing, to become faster, and to become more accurate with our intelligence. And this is interesting by itself because historically there's been a trade-off between speed and accuracy in any task. If I do something quickly, maybe I'm running through mathematical calculations, I'm less accurate and precise, right? So there's a trade-off historically with this, but with digital technologies, they provide us both with the mechanisms of computation that increase accuracy, but also the ability to get data more readily and to inform the decisions we're making. So digitization is actually one of these mechanisms that can make us more agile. Really cool. It's a tool. It's not an end-all be-all, and there's no software in the world that's going to solve all your problems. But some of these tools can be helpful depending on the task for which they are designed and implemented. So Mike and I worked for the last year really considering some of not only the process of digitization, but how a workforce can either enable or impede this process of digitization. And we found some really interesting research. Literally 6 different samples of workers and managers from a variety of industries. And we wanted to assess a couple things. One, what's the appetite for change? When we think about this. 2, what are the existing digitization capabilities of the organization? Does it have a clearly defined objective? Or is there a plan in place that's aligned with strategy? Do they have the resources and the ability to make this happen? And finally, how's the workforce doing as a whole? And so we employed a survey methodology to test some of these questions. It's efficient and it enables us to provide some benchmarking between otherwise disparate organizations. So let me break down some of these findings for us, and we'll unpack these. So when it came to change readiness, across the board, we found that companies only had average change readiness, and these data were collected in the spring and summer of this year. So they're current data. You might expect this, right? Workforce change readiness is a function often of the energy people have, but also the level of change they've had to experience. And although many of your organizations, maybe perhaps you're not really doing a lot internally, you're just kind of responding to what's happening externally in your market with COVID and all the changes that are in demand that have resulted from that. But we see is a very mediocre appetite for change and a change readiness. It's one of those things we ought to be careful about, that we get tired, and it's really easy to have a burned out workforce if we impose too much change on people, and especially too much change where they haven't had a chance to buy in. In the same way, we assessed digitization, and as you can see, the scores were a little better there, which is great. The idea with digitization is, like that most organizations, most managers felt like not only did they have a reasonable capability in place, but they had the right people, and there was at least a plan in place to leverage these technologies and align them with the strategy of the organization. Final thing we looked at was the state of the workforce, and as you can see, despite craziness in COVID, people having to manage dual careers and kids and all kinds of non-work constraints, health concerns, the state of the workforce was actually quite positive across respondents, which shocked me. I thought it would be much lower than that. But I think it is an encouraging sign of resilience, that when we talk about the workers, like that perhaps maybe we are more resilient than we have thought initially. And to see that kind of marker, with the workforce was really encouraging. So To break this down even further, we looked at a couple different dimensions of each of these. These are all called facets, if you will. For example, with regard to change readiness, do people accept change? Well, on a 5-point scale, people were a little bit above the average in acceptance of change. People believe generally that change can be a good thing, but then look at the fatigue numbers, 2.5 out of 5. Very moderate, and in fact, about 1/3 of the employees and managers that we surveyed were just worn out by change. They were tired. And that's very telling. What it means is that when we think about change and mobilization in our workforce, we want to be careful to be very deliberate and to make sure that these are needed, that we're not just changing superfluously because of someone else. Like, oh, my friend did this and was really successful. Maybe that's applicable to you or not. And we want to be cautious about how we mobilize. In the same way, people had generally favorable beliefs about their strategy, the capabilities of digitization, but they also indicated a number of impediments that could derail these initiatives. We'll unpack those in just a second. And finally, as you can see, the state of the workforce is pretty positive. Now, job satisfaction is a facet of engagement. And but when we look at the others, like intrinsic motivation, why people do their work, they're enjoying their work, most of them. Most of them weren't seeking to leave. But interestingly enough, they also indicated that politics and tension were real threats. And when we think about these things, politics, workplace politics, people playing games, playing favorites, and organizational, like that stresses people out. So we want to be cautious about these markers too, because people only have so much energy. And even today, like there are just fewer chances for us to replenish and recharge. Maybe you're feeling that too in your workplace. But this is a cautionary tale for us in terms of how we seek to mobilize the workforce. We want to understand its baseline first. Do these data apply to you? It's one of the questions you should ask. Although we collected, this literally came from hundreds of observations, cases from management, executive management, et cetera. I would say that this could be a useful benchmark, but it's something that you may want to ask your people informally. How are you doing? Like, hey, are you feeling stressed out? Do you feel like, we have a plan in place for this? What's your appetite for a change? These kind of anecdotal one-on-one questions can be really useful as a manager in helping you gauge where your workforce is and how best to mobilize them. All right, moving smartly ahead. So we gave people a huge list, and we even offered them the opportunity to add things to it. Said, hey, if you're going to mobilize, if you're going to do something different, mobilize, and we talk about mobilization change often analogously, but what are some of the key impediments? And as you can see, some really interesting insights from our respondents. So one of the things that we see first is this idea of competing priorities, that people are trying to do too much at once. And I'm an optimistic person, so I tend to take on perhaps too much work than what I can actually do sometimes. But our organizations do the same thing. Organizations have great intentions, and then our managerial landscape is littered with the bodies of good and well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective projects. Be cautious about this. Know what you want to do. Prioritize mobilization and change. What are the 2 things that we want to get done in the next 18 months? And how are these going to make a strategic impact? Let's put our resources in those 2 things. Then if those are successful, what are the next 2 things that we're going to look at, right? It's real hard to have more than 4 to 5 priorities in life at all. And for organizations, that's very much the same. So I would say let's distill that even down. 2 is kind of the magic number there. You need to really major in the majors and minor in the minors, and let's prioritize how we mobilize our workforce, because you have scarce resources. In the same way, culture, we're not talking here about ethnic or racial cultural differences. We're talking about your organization's culture. And your culture can be an accelerator or a significant impediment to any kind of mobilization effort. And many of you all have very functional, healthy workplace cultures, others not as much. If you're not paying attention to that and directly managing culture, your employees will. And so we want to be deliberate about this idea about understanding the culture of our organization. Is this a culture that's going to be receptive to new ideas, to growth, to learning? Is it going to be a culture that accepts new challenges to mobilize? Or will they view this as a threat? So, some things to really consider. All right. Insufficient digital skills, that's self-explanatory. The idea there is basic. When we're pursuing digitalization, in this instance, you want to have people who have the skills to be conversant in those technologies. In the same way, be careful about the things that you employ or seek to employ. We need change leaders in place who are conversant and can help us, be respectfully skeptical One of my colleagues is an HR leader, and she works for a railroad company with 150,000 employees nationwide. And she said, my people are exhausted by just calls from vendors and salespeople all the time, and they have to field these really complex technical questions. That's not their strength. And in the same way, if you're seeking to mobilize, you've got to have change leaders in place who understand whatever it is, the end state, and who are conversant in those sometimes very technical processes. Final thing is the strategy. Like, we've got to have a well-aligned strategy. And so we are doing this because of these reasons. Here's what we seek to gain. Here's where we're going and why. Here's how it's going to offer greater value for our customers and differentiate us from our competitors. And here's why this ROI proposition is useful for our company. Those are some of the components of any kind of strategy. In this instant, a digital strategy. But I think there's a great cautionary tale for us as well. Like, hey, have a good plan in place. Seek feedback from people who engage with customers. Go to your non-exempt employees and talk with them. Sometimes we get these echo chambers of top managers around us, and it's all yes men and women, and that's not helpful. You need folks who are sometimes going to push back. Even say, hey, I'm appointing you as a devil's advocate. I want you to push back on this. Tell me the reasons that this is going to fail. By doing that, you open the door for meaningful dialogue, and you're going to ensure that your strategy is really well aligned with how the organization can offer value, its capabilities, and really what's happening in the competitive pulse of your customer environment. We want to be able to tap into all these things. So these are impediments for us. What are they? They ultimately represent opportunities for change, opportunities to incorporate greater participation, and also to make sure that when we are seeking to mobilize the workforce, be it toward digitalization and agility or something else, that we have a good process in place. All right. So some things to think about. These are some questions that, and again, you'll have access to this. If you want me to send you the deck afterward, I'm happy to. But these are things that I want you to consider in terms of mobilizing the workforce. And the first questions all deal with your context. I don't know your specific competitive context. I don't know the things that you're facing, whether you're oligopolistic or monopolistically competitive. Like, I don't know that. However, you do. And we talk about uncertainty with known parameters or ambiguity with unknown parameters. Like, how dynamic is this? How many unknowns are you operating within? Or do you have a fairly known, fairly stable environment? That's going to differentiate not only the value of agility, but also how you seek to mobilize your workforce. For example, you might think, hey, we need to be pursuing efficiencies, economies of scale and scope, because we are not in a dynamic environment. We're not really in a very uncertain or ambiguous environment. The energy sector, for example, we're still producing energy much the same way we have for about 100 years. And that hasn't changed a lot. Now, there are some things that change within the industry, but at the end of the day, it doesn't tend to be very dynamic. It doesn't tend to be very uncertain. If you're working in consumer products or IT, like, that changes a lot. And so that would be a very different discussion. Agility is going to matter much more for you if you're in that case. How concentrated is the competitive environment? There, I mean, how many competitors do you have, and how much market share do they have? We think about, like, insurance, for example. The insurance companies that you can name off the top of your head have about 20 to 25% of the market share. The rest of it is widely diffuse, spread throughout the country. So we would think about that as a concentrated competitive environment, but really it's not. So what about you? Like, how many competitors do you have in your space? Maybe it's just Knoxville, maybe it's East Tennessee, maybe it's global, but think about that concentration. The next gets back to the workforce. What's their appetite for change? Do they have an appetite for it? Do they see value in it? If not, it's okay to take a respite. It's okay sometimes to give people a chance to recharge their batteries, and even say that, what, we have some great things that we are planning, but we're going to take the next quarter, whatever that is, and we're just going to catch up. And we're going to take a chance to catch our breath, and then we're going to dive in much more readily equipped, more motivated, and more focused to pursue this change. So we're going to mobilize at a later point once we've had a chance to recharge. That's way fair. In the same way, we already talked about the idea of culture as an impediment, but this is something, again, that can be managed. The way that we do things, culture is something that you can lead and manage, and it's not a given, and at the end of the day, it can be a dramatic asset to you if you understand not only the nuances of our culture, but you seek to shape that in positive ways. The next question is just a capability one, like, if agility is your end state, your end game, and it may be, Have you developed those capabilities, the knowledge management, the environmental scanning capabilities? Do you have a good roadmap in place? Are you paying attention to your competitor moves and what your customers are telling you? Those are some of the examples of capabilities that are conducive to agility. And finally, you want to be looking at the state of your workforce. And, by this, I mean, just measuring what's going on, talking with people informally. The targeted assessment is very powerful because you can get down to individuals, and there are amazing software solutions and companies that offer these kind of assessments and this feedback. But at the end of the day, you just really want to know what's going on in your workforce, and not only how they're performing, are they realizing their objectives, what kind of stressors are they dealing with, are they seeking to grow, and if so, how? And when you know that, that's going to help you better align what you're trying to do with that core value process, and it will help you better mobilize the workforce. It's a great baseline to have. So again, some things to think about. It's not an exhaustive discussion by any stretch of the imagination, but I wanted to give some food for thought, and hopefully that is helpful as we seek to mobilize our workforce. And again, agility is an amazing capability, and it's really important for a lot of companies. For others, it will be less important. You're going to want to pursue those economies of scale and scope, but we always want to be looking as top leaders and managers how we pivot toward one or the other, or depending on the business unit. For some of you who are in enterprise organizations, maybe you focus on agility in certain segments because they're customer facing, very dynamic, and then in others they're much more prone toward efficiency dialogues. That's a possibility too, and you can definitely wire both successfully. All right, so that's all I've got as far as content. Really, I'm here. I'm at your disposal. If you want, whatever you want to talk about today, I'll talk about. You want to talk about the weather? We'll talk about the weather. But I also wanted to give you a chance to dialogue and offer comments or questions, because these things are complex. This is top heavy, but at the end of the day, there's also a lot of collective wisdom, and many of you all have amazing experiences from which to draw. So with that in mind, I will welcome your comments and questions.
So Tim, it looks like we've got a couple that have come in, and Erica and Adam have been collecting those. I've got a couple myself, of course, just because of my deep abiding interest in the area, but I'll go last.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim. So first question is there an ideal worker and or leader in digital transformation? If so, what factors would you use as selection criteria, and what could be developed once on board?
Great questions. And yes, there are people who are more adept and more capable to lead digital transformation than others. The very basic requirement is the technological understanding that person has. They need to understand the digital technologies. They need to be conversant in these technologies, and that's the necessary but insufficient condition. The next is that the folks need to have an understanding of how these these technologies are going to translate into the value chain. And that's going to differ depending on the organization, but ultimately they've got to be able to understand how these things actually offer value. Companies do crazy stuff and invest buku bucks sometimes just because of isomorphic pressure. They see somebody else or a buddy doing it. Oh, my old roommate from Yale is doing this, so I should do it too. It's not a good reason. How is it driving value? The third thing is that digital leaders also need to understand how to communicate with people, and to also build consensus that helps them achieve their objectives. You can roll out an enterprise level solution, you can roll out all kinds of digital technologies, but people don't necessarily use them unless you've taken the time to train, to build consensus, to show people the value proposition that results as a function of that. So those are kind of three broad thematic components that I would look for in folks who are leading in this space. Now, how do you select for those is a slightly more sophisticated question. The best way I know how is to actually ask people very technical questions related to whatever type of technology you're trying to implement, and also to go and talk to the folks that have worked with them. How do they communicate? How are they leaders? Are they force feeding this to people? Are they is it the fire hydrant, or are they really encouraging folks, influencing folks positively? And that's going to differ. Your needs, as an organization, let me rephrase that. The type of leader, someone who is very much, transformational, or, tends to be a little bit more transactional, that's the utility will depend on who you are as a company and your culture.
Thanks, Tim. So my next question is, there seems to be a need for decision making to be devolved down the organization as per your example. Did you get data on people's belief that they had the discretion and freedom to make decisions?
Oh, that's huge, 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 huge. Yes, yes, absolutely. And in fact, it is the non-executives and non-managers sometimes who have the most important strategically valuable insights because they are client-facing, where your executives aren't. They're up there somewhere in the C-suite talking about all these different things, or they're talking to vendors or their buddies on different boards trying to get ideas. The decision-making process, getting input and participation across the organization is critical. And I even argue sometimes especially if you work in an oligopolistic space, getting input from your customers before you consider and employ digital technologies is very critical. So yes, as a general rule of thumb, the greater you have participation in decision-making, the more likely you are to get buy-in, to get consensus, and to get people to be really involved in implementing that vision, helping it be realized. Now, the other question too, is how you roll that out. And I think this is actually a great opportunity to informally reward people. If you see employees who exhibit, commitment to the company, who maybe even hourly employees working on an assembly line, but these folks, they've worked for years, they're committed to the organization. One way to incentivize and reward these people is actually to appoint them as, like a change advisor, whatever you want to call it in your organization, or a workforce leader, and they provide input. It's advisory. It doesn't have to be taken in, like it's not binding by any stretch, but that kind of feedback mechanism, that kind of participation is going to strengthen the intelligence you have, and it will also help you really avoid roadblocks that sometimes can't be foreseen from the C-suite or from a vendor.
Thanks, Tim. I've got another question for you. How is the message back to leadership that fatigue has set in received in your experience?
So it depends on the leader. Some leaders respond with, suck it up, and we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps here, and I don't want any more whining from these sissies. And you get that tends to be one response. The other response is I didn't even know. Well, okay, what is this, and why should I be paying about it? Because I came from finance or engineering, and all I know is people as a cost center. So that's one. And then you have folks who are like, okay, thank you. That's a symptom. What's driving that, and what are the implications of it? So I think you have kind of three different phases of leaders who respond to this change fatigue idea. We also tend to superimpose our own values and expectations on others. So what you expect of yourself as a leader often will be superimposed on your subordinates or your organization. If you own an organization or run a unit, a division, whatever, it often will reflect that value proposition. So the caveat, of course, the caution is that, you need to know your leaders to be able to predict and forecast how they're going to respond.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. So I have another question for you.
Sure.
How can we combat fatigue when we need to fight our way through not only the pandemic, but also the economic fallout? It seems that people ramped up for a sprint that turned into an actual marathon.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't want to minimize it or reduce it. I think a lot of the answer to that question has to do with how we frame things as organizations. And, you talked about the idea of a sprint that turned into a marathon. Absolutely. And for the foreseeable future, if you look at the history of pandemics, often pandemics can run a 4 to 5 year course. And so the way that I handle this, as a leader in my own organization is the way that I frame what I ask of people. And first of all, I acknowledge the fact that folks may be fatigued. I encourage them to come to me when they're feeling like they're too depleted. There's a difference between being fatigued and depleted, as far as your ability, like when you're burned out and depleted, where you really feel like your productivity is suffering. I want to be able to understand that in my folks. So I encourage them to come to me. And then the third thing is when I make an ask, I ask their perspective as well. So for example, I don't use delegated goal setting. I use participative goal setting, where I sit down with our employees or our fellows or our junior consultants and say, hey, here's what we need to accomplish this year. What do you think? Do you think this is possible? It's doable? And if, to the extent that they trust me, that dialogue, that communication is going to be productive, because they can push back if they need to, and that's going to help me recalibrate my expectations as well. But yes, we have to understand, we have to be compassionate, and to the extent possible, we also want to be flexible.
Thanks, Tim. Another question for you. Do you see a needed shift for HR functions under an agile organization? Doesn't an HR compliance and rules only approach slow things down rather than facilitate agility?
Yes, yes, and yes. An agile workforce, it's interesting. HR over the years, perhaps because of legal liability, they've become much more compliance driven in many organizations than they are strategic partners. It's not universal. There are organizations that do HR right, and they view it as a competitive contributor. They view it as a differentiator. But when it comes to agility, there is absolutely critical that you have HR that is aligned with that. And that means changing how we source our employees, socialize them, and onboard them. That means changing how we train and develop them. Cross-training, for example, mentoring programs. These are examples of practices that are HR related that help you become more agile with your workforce, and they help you better mobilize. So if you're not wired for that at all, if you don't have a formal mentoring program, that enables people to, to pick and select mentors that are going to help them, if you don't have cross-training opportunities or development opportunities, that's going to inhibit your ability to become more agile as a workforce, as an organization. So yes, HR is a critical conduit in that. And I find most HR leaders, first of all, they're the snazziest dressers in the room, right? And this is not a diss. I used to work in HR. I'm not a snazzy dresser. Maybe that's why I'm now in academia. They're snazziest dressers in the room, and they are always cover your rear is like the philosophy of everything. I got to get 50 approvals before I make a choice. And working with HR leaders, like I do all the time in a workforce analytics consultancy, like it takes years before people make choices because they're so scared of the liability or they're scared to take ownership. We need to change the narrative on that. Like there's a reason that most HR leaders don't rise to the CEO or COO level. And it's because they're very myopic in how they view the organization. So becoming a little more strategic is one of those first things we look at. Like we've got to understand value creation and how HR can support that and also differentiate us competitively.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so I have a final question on my end. As we look at our internal organizations and adapting to these COVID times, do you observe that the vast array of markets are as invested in agility and digitalization, or are you seeing that the macro market is becoming inevitably fatigued? We are seeing the market at 50-50, much more market fatigue than we expected this time of year.
Yeah, it's gonna vary depending on what industry you're in and the size of the organization. Typically, enterprise level organizations tend to be early adopters of digitization, and they're going to be ahead of others, especially small and medium-sized businesses. But yes, there is a fatigue in some ways. At the same token, even small mom and pop stores are now leveraging digitization because they have to, like online ordering, like online protocols, online review systems, and like the interface has changed from an in-person to a virtual. And so, COVID has necessitated an acceleration of those investments, which I think are paying off. We'll see, whether, consumers have their favorites at the end of the day. Consumers have favorite brands, they have favorite stores, they have favorite vendors that they prefer, that they want to see survive. And to the extent that they can continue to engage with those organizations, they will continue to survive. So, it is very much ultimately a value proposition that we're seeing. With regard to, the market as far as appetite for digitalization, yes. Some people have had plans in place to digitize, to roll it out in various segments of the supply chain or the workforce. They've had to backtrack, or they've had to change or pivot because those resources are needed elsewhere. And that's also going to happen too. So if you're a seller of digital products, or if you're working, with solutions or tools, like it can become really cumbersome and hard because so many folks are having to defray financial resources elsewhere.
So the team sent me a note that was kind of the last of the questions. So let me pose my last question to you.
Final Jeopardy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So please form your answer in the phrase of a question. We've done a really good deep dive here, and I think there's quite a bit of meat. If a young executive comes to you and says, "Hey, I saw your leadership at lunchtime session talk, and what advice and guidance would you give me, not just to survive the next 12 months, but to thrive over the next few years, and to find the good and the bad of this entire circumstance that we see today?"
That's a good question. I think I would encourage them to consider their perspective. How we define success in this era of dynamicism and uncertainty is different than perhaps how we've defined success traditionally. And many are subject to career transitions, sometimes very abrupt, unwanted career transitions, changes in their organization, slack structure. It may be harder to get promotion. It may be harder to get a raise or a bonus if you have a job still, you know. And so one of the things that I would encourage a young executive who's in this process first is to really consider perspective, like, what does success mean? I believe that work is a means to a greater end. And one of the ends is that we have a positive impact on the lives of others around us, including your family, including the people that you work with and engage, your customers, your suppliers, et cetera. And you may not be able to realize those P&L goals. You may not, there's just a lot we can do. You can have the very best, cleanest shop ever in the world, the most well-run, well-led company ever. But if customer demand is not there for your products or services, you're going to suffer, and you may have really hard times. You can't necessarily control that. So with regard to, even with due respect to Say's law, supply creates its own demand. At the end of the day, we have to focus on what really is important. And the other thing that I would consider telling people too is this idea that you need to continue to develop and learn and grow. These hard times when we are planted, and hard times when we assume power and responsibility, and hard times, it actually makes us so much more effective when the market bounces back. If people came into a market and everything's easy, money hides all kinds of sins and bad performance errors and bad leadership. It's people are making money. People overlook, all these different things. You can neglect and really harshly treat your workforce, for example, have bad culture. But when the chips are down, when resources are down, that's the opportunity where these things really matter, really differentiate how we lead. And I would encourage people to keep growing. That may mean gaining education. That may mean developing skills, that discretionary skills, whatever that looks like view this as a chance not only to make an impact on the lives around you, but also to really keep pushing yourself as an individual, so that when times bounce back, you're going to be well prepared and well ahead of your peers, and your company will be better positioned as a result.
Yeah, that's absolutely phenomenal. And I think we see the fact of people buying the up or out, when in fact lateral moves and understanding that there is no one career path and ladder ahead. And you've done a terrible thing, is that you've got my mind moving again. And so I'm going to ask the second final question. I think just rolls it all together. What you just talked about is the critical need for resilience in people and organizations. We saw that through some of the other supply chain projects that come out. So can you give us just a final thought on how do you build resilience? And institutionally and or individually, because I think that's going to be one of the telling factors.
It is, and there are a lot of related constructs. We think about Kabas's idea of hardiness. That's a trait. Some people are hardier than others. Resilience can be learned. That's one of the key differences between hardiness and resilience, is the developmental component of resilience. And we talk about resilience. It's the idea that we keep moving and keep striving. This is where leadership becomes so critically important. Carl Weick, the famous psychologist from Michigan, always talked about this idea that organizations help make sense out of the world. And that's the primary goal of organizational leadership as well, is to help make sense out of this world and what's going on. And and we're seeing now, the difference between really effective and less effective leaders because of how people have responded via COVID. But I think building that capability starts first with making sense out of the world around us, or attempting to, and also helping people understand the value proposition. There's also a sense of camaraderie as well, that when you know that this is temporary, the pandemic's not going to last forever, it is temporary, and that there are others who are walking the hard path with you, you can go that extra mile sometimes. And I love this idea of camaraderie, and that there's in organizations, we support each other. We're not competing against each other. I tend to view my coworkers as family, as in many ways. And I feel like that's very powerful in building that organizational resilience. I don't want to hurt my family. I want them to be successful, because when they are, I am too. And that's the same thing we try to instill in employees, this idea of cooperation and growth together. So those are just two things that I would look at. I mean, that's one reason why I love talking to elderly people, because it seems like nothing really phases them. They've seen it all. Folks who've lived a long time, they've seen things, and the things that shock us, that cause us stress and strain, and worst case scenario, you're still going to be okay. And so, you know, I love that perspective that they have too. And I feel like leaders can often provide that too to their people.
Yeah, thank you so much. I started off by saying that we couldn't have picked a better person. And I was so thankful you had availability to this finale for us. And it's proven absolutely true. So thanks so
Thanks.
much for kind of helping us this story on such a powerful forward-looking note. I appreciate the work that I get a chance to do with you as well, and I look forward to a lot more of that. And I hope that you stay safe and healthy through the rest of the week. And those that are listening in, please share the LinkedIn Tiny URL site because we have all of our recordings posted there. And we're going to build that into a resource for people that weren't able to kind of participate in the live sessions to go back and to kind of feed forward. Tim, thanks again so much, my brother. And have a great rest of your week. And for everyone else on the call, have a great rest of your week as well. And if my team would hold on just for a quick AR afterwards. So Tim, thanks again.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. Be well, everyone. Take care.